what are we actually measuring? And then more importantly, why are we measuring it? Like, how are we ranking the level of importance of these different domains of fitness as it relates to the job that somebody needs to be able to do?
So I think there definitely needs to be some type of standard, but it is a fine line because the politics of everything kind of ruin it. Just like everywhere in the country, there's unions that fight it. There's political aspects of administrations, things like that.
Whether it's a fellow officer, whether it's a victim, whether it's just a innocent bystander that's in shock, there's a lot of value in being able to grab that person in any which way and get them from point A to B in any which way. Based on your body type, you can train and you can strategize however you want to do that, but the point is you need to do it. Welcome to Blue Grit Radio, the podcast that explores making better cops for a better community. I'm your host, Eric Tung. I've been an active police officer since 2007. We will dive into the aspects of police culture, health and wellness, leadership, and mindset. You'll hear from experts not only from policing, but all industries as they relate to being our best with purpose, passion, and positivity. Join me as we share stories, lessons, and advice so we can all be better for ourselves, our teams, our families, and our communities. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another episode of Blue Grit Radio. This is your host, Eric, and today I'm joined by two guests. We're going to be talking about officer fitness standards, and I know that can be kind of contentious, and that's why we're talking about it. We're going to start the episode with some agreed assumptions. One is that standards are important. Two is that lowering or removing standards is not a good thing. But we're going to be talking about how to maximize them, right? Like, we have a lot of historical standards that we've talked about on and off the show that may not make the most sense. And so I have a couple experts that come from human performance, from physiology with strength and conditioning backgrounds, tactical athletic backgrounds. So without further ado, I want to let Scott Howell and Chris Curris introduce themselves. So Scott, you've been on the show before with Ironside's podcast. Welcome back. Can you please give the listeners an introduction if they're not familiar, which would be super weird, but please introduce yourself, where you're from, and what it is you work on and in.
Well, first off, thanks so much, Eric, for having me on the show. Especially, I'm honored to be here with you again. This is fantastic. And then obviously with my buddy Chris over on the other side of the country. I've had Chris on the show before when we talked about similar stuff, and it's always good to get good people together. And I'm stoked to be here and honored. So thanks for having me. My background is in human performance. I've been in sort of the fitness industry and human performance for the better part of, I was doing math the other day, it's been about 27 years. Mostly in commercial and corporate fitness, and I currently own and have for the last 15 years. My business is Red Dot Fitness, and that's located in San Jose, California. We generally work with the general population, but over my years and specifically at Red Dot, I've gotten the opportunity to work with all different types of not just clients, but also coaches that come from a lot of different backgrounds. And some of those are professional athletes. Some of those are just your desk jockey that just trying to look better, perform better, and feel better, just be generally healthier. And I guess it was about 3 years ago, I started a podcast. It's called the Ironsides Podcast. And it's kind of a multifaceted, but stays in the realm of health, fitness, business. I guess we get into the relationships piece a little bit too.
Yeah, that's life.
Yeah, exactly. It just kind of comes up. But I have the distinct privilege, and I don't know how it happened, but getting together with individuals that are highly involved and highly skilled in the world of law enforcement, they're first responders, members of the military, veterans, to talk about all things that kind of fit into the pie chart of all the things that maybe a tactical athlete or somebody that's in the tactical space, which may be a contentious term too, going back to that word. But that's given me a lot of insight. And along the way, I had the opportunity to work with a lot of folks that do what you guys do in law enforcement. And that's kind of brought me to another company called In Extremis Performance, where we work very specifically building human performance programs for law enforcement officers. It really started in the special operations community of law enforcement. So more of the guys that are kind of at the front door kicking doors, but doing things that may be a little bit different than what the typical patrol officer might see. But at the same time, what we recognized and what I recognized was the huge gap that exists between the training that exists for some of these special operations teams as opposed to the patrol officer that's out there on the street. Recognizing really the needs are the same. The job may look and feel a little bit different, but we're talking about humans here, and they all need the same stuff, and it's just how we apply that stuff and how we educate and bring them that information. So I've been heavily involved with this for a long time. I'm hugely passionate about it. The podcast is again mostly health, fitness, wellness. We cover a lot of topics, but when it comes to preparing people for the jobs that they do and the thing that they need to do every single day, whether that is the amateur person or again the desk jockey, or the officer on the street that needs to get something done, or a firefighter for that matter, who needs to serve the public in a way in sort of high risk and very dynamic environments. I really dug deep in that, and I'm having a really good time seeing some really cool things and getting to work with some really amazing people. So that's about the Reader's Digest version of it, man.
Dude, I love it. And you covered a lot of ground, and it gives us a good purview, especially those that aren't familiar with you and your content. But I'm glad you even gave us a sneak peek to things that I'm sure we're going to talk about, and I'd like to talk about, which is IEP, right, and extremis.
Sure.
I have a couple guys that recently went through the course with amazing things to say about it. And these are guys that are pretty well versed and very interested in these topics. So great takeaways there that we will get to in time. All right, Chris, could you please introduce yourself and tell us about your background and what it is you do these days?
Sure, and I'll definitely start out by saying thank you to both you guys for having me on. It's always a privilege and a lot of fun to meet great people in this industry. So my background, trying to keep it short. Prior to law enforcement, I did 6 years at University of Central Florida as a strength and conditioning coach for football, baseball, track, and cheerleading. And when I realized, more or less, there's not a whole lot of job security in that world, as much fun as it was and as rewarding as it was, I wanted something better. I've like everybody in law enforcement, military says, I had a calling, if you will, and was lucky enough to get hired in emergency in South Florida pretty quickly. My degrees are in exercise science, or sports and exercise science, with I'm working on a master's degree in psychology. So I'm diving into the mental aspect of a lot of stuff that we do when it comes to performance as well, and how we process and problem solve, along with also the physical aspect. When I actually first started my side company, which is Tactical Human Performance, my goal was to address like the pre-academy or the tactical athlete and create workout programs and stuff like that. That's how I linked up with like Jeff Nichols and a bunch of other like strength coaches and keeping those networks going. And I realized most first responders don't give a shit. There's not a great market for it, and a lot of people get by on the skin of their teeth, it seems like, and just because they haven't been tested, they think they're okay, and it's very frustrating to see. But it was a good pivot point for me. I now focus more on training with firearms, tactics, stuff like that. That's like why I'm teaching here with John Dufresne. And the rabbit hole goes really deep when it comes to standards. Like my agency doesn't have one. Once everybody graduates the academy, you're kind of, all right, you're an adult now, do what you want. And that's how you get the bulging bellies over the gun belts, or the guys who can't jump over a 3-foot wall type of thing. So I think there definitely needs to be some type of standard, but it is a fine line because the politics of everything kind of ruin it. Just like everywhere in the country, there's unions that fight it. There's political aspects of administrations, things like that. So it's definitely something that needs to be addressed. And I don't know what the right route is, but there's got to be something. Because God forbid, and I give this speech to all my recruits because I'm under a training unit, be the officer that if God willing, or God forbid, your family is in need of like an active shooter response, what kind of cop do you want to show up to save them? Do you want to be the fat guy who doesn't give a shit? Or are you going to be the bad mofo who's worked out every day and goes to the range on their own, trains jiu-jitsu or does whatever and shows up and is going to be the hero? Or are you going to be a guy that got out of breath from the front door to your car? So it's sometimes it reaches them, sometimes it doesn't. But that's the fun motivational aspect I get to deal with sometimes.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I appreciate that, Chris. And in that, you said a lot of things, and we'll just start off, right? And it's it's that discomfort with the truth. And
Hmm.
it's a lot of, I think you said it in this way, that they think they're okay. And I would actually
Hmm.
submit that most recognize that they're not okay and they're rolling the dice. And that's a really
Hmm.
scary thing to contend with. So they don't want to face the music by going in the gym and finding out,
Hmm.
or like concretely, how out of shape they are, or hitting the range outside of quals, especially when you have really good trainers that are like, hey, we're going to try something new, something different. It's going to challenge you. It might incorporate something like, running down the field and back, and then hopping
Hmm.
into the range, and then getting some shots off, right, with an elevated blood pressure and all these, kind of the stress inoculation that you can introduce. Like, that's really scary for people. They don't want to
Yeah.
be exposed, and that's a really cruddy attitude when we are talking about, do you want to be the cop on the day um, that is going to perform and rise to the level of your training and your mindset, or are you going to roll the dice and just see what comes out the other end? Because we know what that looks like.
Yeah, I think a lot of it's driven probably by ego. Nobody wants to feel that vulnerability or that fragility, if they will. And I started reading a book recently, The Ego is the Enemy, which
Mm,
kind of took me down a rabbit hole, which could be a whole nother conversation, but I'll keep it short. In law enforcement, I've been kind of going back and forth. How bad is ego? Could ego for actually drive a person to, hey, I'm going to enter that room because I think I'm a badass, and maybe I'm not, but at least they're going in?
mm.
Or can it also be bad because their ego thinks that their skill level is up to a point that's really not, and they could end up getting hurt? So I think it's something I've been going back and forth on to figure out.
Yeah. The answer is yes.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's both, and it is the balance, right? And ego
Hmm.
can be all those things. It can be what gets you. Your ego can actually help you get uncomfortable,
Hmm.
recognizing a lot of things, right? It can also get you into that position because, I mean, shoot, we talk about school shootings, active shooter. A lot
Yeah.
of times it's like cop at first sight. You're going to have a conflict, or the person's going to off themselves. Either way, the killing has stopped, right? And so that could be okay. That, I mean, actually, I'll say that that's great. We want coppers to get in the door. We've seen what
Hmm.
the failure of that is, and then yeah, you work with what you got. And sometimes there is the Hail Mary in any vein of operations where maybe you are a little undertrained, but shoot, you can rely on what you got. Your mindset, your courage can get you there. But we don't want to rely on that. I think that's our agreement, that let's control the controllables. And for a lot of that, a lot of us, myself included, there's a lot more that we can be doing strategically too. It doesn't
Oh, for
necessarily
sure.
take a ton of time or a ton of money or a ton of training, right? It's just recognizing some of these lower hanging fruits.
Yeah, leaving as little to luck and chance as possible.
Yeah.
Everybody I think in this industry is pretty much a little bit of a control freak to the level of like, all right, they're not going to roll the dice on anything. They're going to control everything that they can to an extent.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Chris, do you mind if I keep it with you? And I'm curious what your
Sure.
fitness standards look like. A very common one nationwide and historically is kind of the Cooper standard. So that's your 300-meter run. That's your
Hmm.
mile and a half run. That's push-ups and sit-ups.
So currently, my agency does not have one. My team has one. For our tryout, it's a beach run on soft sand for about a mile and a half. Push ups, pull ups, dummy drag of a 100-pound sandbag, or as a carry, I should say, and some burpees and stuff like that. And then we have an annual test that keeps us like making sure nobody's like kind of falling off the wagon. But usually we kind of just start bullying and shaming each other if somebody starts looking a little sloppy at the same time. Like I think bullying actually, yeah, and someone will probably take this out of context, but in law enforcement, like make it great again,
Mm,
because you can get pretty far with just social peer pressure and just keep poking them a
yeah.
little bit more, and maybe it snaps them out of it. Because there was one guy on my team, a couple guys like threw a couple jabs at him. He ended up losing like 40 pounds, and now he looks like a freaking GQ model. And he looks fantastic. So sometimes
Yeah.
bullying does have its place.
Well, that,
I know the military did a whole revamp. What was I think in like around 2010, where they started redoing their fitness standards to be very similar to that, with adding sleds and farmers carries and stuff like that. That's what I kind of think the world or the standards should go to, not just the calisthenics portion of it. If that answers your question, there's a lot
yeah.
more to
Yeah,
our
it totally
job
does.
that requires more diversity of skill set than just, all right, how many push-ups and sit-ups? Like, if you want to have a really interesting conversation, talk about sit-ups with Jeff Nichols, and he will go off on a very long tangent about how stupid he thinks sit-ups are, but somehow they make it into every PT test around the country. So,
yeah, out in Washington State, we had the test I explained, right? The sprint, the run, the push-ups, the sit-ups, and because running injuries are so prevalent from people training for it, people actually doing the entry-level test, and that's all we have that's required too. They did away with all the running, and then they switched to squat thrusts instead, right? So you push up, you sit up, and then you squat thrust, which is for listeners, and I know that there's different variations, but basically it's a burpee without the jump, without the push up. And so, does it incorporate some cardio with lower impact? Sure, but we'll leave that there, right? So that's the test. But I love how you incorporate some things, and some things that I would also, in my ideal test, incorporate, like a dummy drag, because that is, I think, an example where you're recognizing the environment that we all have, right? We all have different body types. We're all different sizes and heights and things, but ultimately, a 150 to 200 pound person is a 150 to 200 pound person. And we have to recognize that any of us may encounter that person, whether it's a fellow officer, whether it's a victim, whether it's just a innocent bystander that's in shock. There's a lot of value in being able to grab that person in any which way and get them from point A to B in any which way. Based on your body type, you can train and you can strategize however you want to do that, but the point is you need to do it. So I love an example like that.
Yeah, and over the years, like, I've come across a bunch of different standards. So I forget what the agency was, but it was like bend over and pick up a pencil off the floor. Like, be able to lay on your back and be able to stand up. I'm like, all right, I guess that's a fitness standard, if you will. Maybe if they're like 75 years old after a hip replacement. But it's definitely an interesting way to look at stuff, because I know, like, the NTOA preached their standard, which was like 18 pull-ups in kit or something, where it kind of like a little outrageous, and when you compare it to maybe tactical teams or one thing, but the rest of the world is not doing that. So it's a very fine line of, there's even been, I think, some of them where you can't even have a waistline over like size 40, which I kind of find interesting, because one of my best friends is a bigger body dude, but he can run and swim for days, and he's one of the strongest, most athletic, most dangerous people I've ever met. Like, if he gets a hold of you, you're done. Because he's also like a brown belt in jiu-jitsu and like a world-class wrestler. Like, if he wants to rape you, you can't stop him. So, but he's got like a 44-inch waist, but he'll murder anybody that tries to hurt him. So it's interesting that some people go for the physical look with professionalism versus the capability of athletic performance as well. So that's, again, another rabbit hole, because this is not a weird topic, but it can go a lot of different ways. That's why I think it's been so hard, I think, to get traction nationwide as a whole for law enforcement.
Yeah. Scott, what are your thoughts? We've talked about a lot of different topics, kind of zigzagging, but I'm good with it. We're getting it all out on the table.
I agree. I think the things that I'm hearing you guys talk about are you're identifying the problems, and I don't think that and then the inherent problems that exist within. I'll circle back to that, but I think when you look at this stuff and I hear what's going on, it's not unfamiliar to me. I mean, one of the things that got said right off the bat was, like, there really isn't a standard. There may be a standard at your particular department, or maybe there isn't. In Chris's case, there isn't one after the academy, but somehow there's standards that are adopted, for the different teams or the different groups, or maybe a department does that, somebody's championed it, and then you look at the standard. I think we've identified there's a problem. Like, there's a vast gap. You have some that are very fit, some that aren't, and fitness isn't everything, but it is a large part of the responsibility, I think, of anybody that's a first responder, because that physicality is going to come into play at some point. I think, going back to the awareness piece, I mean, more than ever, we're seeing it. It's being exposed on body worn camera footage, the CCTV footage and stuff that we're seeing, and some of it looks great and some of it looks really bad. And and not that fitness is going to solve all those problems, but having some level of fitness also brings, going back to Chris's psychology part, it brings some level of confidence to that I can do this, and I can go hands on, or I'm not, it's happening in the background. I'm not worried. Like, I get into an incident or whatever it happens to be, And I'm not worried about my physicality here. I've got that part handled. It's like shooting, if you want to look at it that way. If when you start getting into things like OISs and again some other controversial topics like CQB, and what you hear is like all of that should be happening in the background. There's so many other things that are going on. Well, if you don't have that in the background, you're already at a massive disadvantage. So in terms of the level of importance, it should rank up there as a priority. And so again, the problem being identified is that it isn't. And then when we have prioritized it in some cases, the next thing would be like, what are we actually testing here? What are we actually trying to figure out? So again, going back to Cooper standards with the 300-meter shuttle run, or 300-meter shuttle, the mile-and-a-half run, the sit-ups and the push-ups and the pull-ups wherever they fit in, or the bar hang or whatever else. What are we actually measuring? And then more importantly, why are we measuring it? Is it important? Like, how are we ranking the level of importance of these different domains of fitness as it relates to the job that somebody needs to be able to do? And so, when I look at it, it really isn't that complicated. There's some complexity in the application of these things, but it isn't that complicated. There's some very basic things that these particular humans should have on board and downloaded. And, it's really simple to me. And I get it can be a little complex, and then it gets controversial. Like, how do you do it? The application piece, which is a whole other part of it. But look, strength matters. Strength is the basis for all the things that you're going to build on top of that thing. And it's not strength so that you can manhandle somebody. I look at strength more from the perspective of what it does is it provides me, again, that platform to build movement from. Right? Movement being the most important thing. We could come back to that in a minute. When I say movement, I mean your ability to move your body, like squat, push, pull, lunge, rotate, those kind of things. But the strength piece is going to help you with your resiliency and keep you in the fight, or get you recovered from the thing, whatever it happens to be doing that you're doing, whether it's a workout or an incident. So I look at that. What are we doing to train that? Well, you hit push-ups and you hit sit-ups in there. And you hit some running, right? And then again, the pull-ups, sometimes they fit in and sometimes they don't. Okay, well, that will build some strength to it until it doesn't, right?
Mm-hmm.
And what are we doing to continue to build that? And the other things that I would layer onto that would be speed and power, your ability to express that strength that you have, right? And in all the different ways that you might have to express it. We could go down a huge rabbit hole of all the scenarios, and that's a whole other problem in trying to revolve training or fitness around scenario training. But speed and power are extraordinarily important. And there are things that get layered in there. There's nuance with that as that gets layered in, like how much strength do you need? How much speed and power do you need? And what are we actually doing to build those things? And how are we actually testing that? And then obviously, the running piece, I think, really hits the endurance side of things. When people think endurance, I think that whole concept gets very convoluted, and I think it's very confusing for people.
Mm-hmm.
And they think, maybe I can come back to that, but the endurance piece is very complex. And when you start to look at the strength and the speed and power components and how we're applying endurance training, and I'll refer to it as capacity. It's how we refer to it at IEP. And really, that's your ability to do the strength and the speed and power for a period of time. What is your ability to continue to do that thing for a period of time, whether it's 10 seconds, 30 seconds, 30 minutes, whatever. And then when we look at we're talking specifically law enforcement officers, what do they actually have to do? How much of this capacity, or again, I'll use the term in air quotes here, endurance, how much do they really need? I mean, what does running a 5K 3 or 4 days a week, what is that actually providing for you? I'm not saying running a 5K is bad. I'm just saying, is there a purpose for this? And can you articulate or define what that purpose is? So wrapping it or coming all the way back to standards, I think you go back to the Cooper stuff. Look, the Cooper standards came out for a reason, and that was the first kind of scientific thing that they could do where they had data and they could relate, like, this data for this mile and a half run equates to this thing in terms of muscular and cardiovascular endurance. That's great, because at least we can measure what it is we're actually testing. But then in the application beyond that, what else? What are we leaving off of the table? And obviously, Cooper standards didn't handle any of that. And I recognize the I guess the I don't want to, the word that's come to my mind is bureaucracy, but it's what we know, it's what we've done, and so that's what we do. And people, are continually going back to that because they can tick a box. They can say, hey, well, we did this and it equates to this, so we know we met this thing.
Mm-hmm.
And so what that comes down to really for me, and part of the problem, and again, what I think we're seeing with body cam footage is there needs to be a higher level of education here. And we really need to be taking and looking at our law enforcement officers as athletes. And they need to look at themselves that way. Chris mentioned the psychology or the mindset piece of, I think you did too, Erica, getting into the room. But, that's important. Like, obviously that's a thing. And there's a hiring, a recruitment and a hiring piece that goes into that, and an evaluation piece. That's a whole other podcast for a whole other time, probably. But, when you're looking at, like, what does a person need to understand? And then what education are we providing them to be able to, one, do this at a department level, so that what we're doing is effective and meets the needs of the officer, not just meets the needs of some Cooper standard thing, right? And then from there, like, how do we get this into the culture, so find some champions inside the culture that can perpetuate it and educate folks on what to do, so that we're not adopting things and leaving some people with a sense of a false sense of self-confidence, but also laying a foundation for them to do this for the rest of their career, right? Because this is not something you do, going back to the academy standards and things, that unfortunately, to Chris's point, is probably for a large majority of the officers the most fit they're ever going to be in their life, right, in their career. And how did they get there? They got there from running a lot, right, and doing some sit-ups and some push-ups. And again, it was whatever, 8 weeks, 12 weeks, 16 weeks, however long this academy happens to be. They achieved a level of quote-unquote fitness that met a quote-unquote standard, that then that's what they go back to. So when they think about, like, oh, I got to get in shape now, well, what do I got to do? To your point, Eric, well, we got to go out and run, but I don't have the strength downloaded. I don't have the power piece downloaded, which is a huge component of running, right? And particularly when you're in the fight, that running doesn't look like a 5K, doesn't look like a 300-meter shuttle run either, right? It's generally a sprint, right? And it's short, and you're doing it from a dead standstill and all these things. So again, without getting too far into the weeds here, the point is, I think there needs to be a higher level of awareness. There needs to be more education around this, and we need to be treating our officers like they're athletes, and they should have access to professionals that can help them become a better athlete with whatever they happen to have, wherever they're coming into it, in their journey, their time, their space, their past, their present, and their future, and set them up for success. And I think that's part of the broken policing model, is we give them something and then we send them out and go, now you're good to go. Namaste, have a good day. You're good. And you go out there and there's really nothing else after that. So I think the standards fall short. We've identified that. But the real question is like, what should the standards be, probably? And then how do we get there? Can we get some agreements on that? If we agree there's a problem, then let's start to find some solutions. So
yeah, Scott, man, you covered a lot, and I think that it may be worthy for listeners to listen back to that, because it's talking about a lot of the integral points of this, right? Like, I took some notes. So what are we testing, right? And to your point, combining some of your points, a lot of folks, when they come into the job, I came out of recruiting kind of recently, right? So there's a lot of people that are like, man, I gotta get my push-ups up before I can test. And this is not to disparage them. Cool, like, you recognize you want to do this job, now start taking it seriously. And they get to the point, and I'll say, like, many people know, and I know across the country, a lot of candidates and recruits get to the point where they can do 20 or 25 or whatever the number is, and that's where they stop. Right? They get to the point where they can do enough push-ups, enough sit-ups, and then if they have to be tested again, like literally after they're hired, before they go to the academy or mid-academy or late academy, you hear about a lot of people from all kinds of academies where they have a classmate or two that fall short, right? What kind of precedent does that set for your career, man? Like, man or ma'am, like, you are literally, you recognize so much in the academy, like how dire the situation might be. But I don't want to spend too much time talking about that. But we get it, right? So one, what are we testing? And for push-ups, you're testing literally your ability to push up. Now, it's not to say that someone with good upper body strength endurance can't do a lot of push-ups, but what I'm suggesting, maybe going off of Riff and what you're talking about, is let's reverse engineer that, right? What do we want cops to be able to do? And then how do we adequately evaluate that? And then maybe what makes even more sense is we make it a movement that's practical. So a mile and a half run. Who's running a mile and a half ever? And for me, it's just canine guys, but I did canine, and even though I might have done multiple miles, like I did stop and go, and it's standing, it's walking back this way, it's jogging, it's sprinting, it's stopping, it's lifting a dog over a fence, it's going over the fence myself. Like it's not a mile and a half run at all. And it's in gear, right? And so you can have someone, to your point, Scott, like someone training for a mile and a half, and then you put on some normal gear, not even extra mags, just normal gear. And what can they actually do? Like, what can they actually crank out with some boots on? Or when they have to step off a curb or step up 3 steps and then continue on their journey. It's all over the place what people can actually do. And so I love how a lot of your points incorporate all these things. And I also want to take a moment to nod to strength and endurance, right? Like, growing up, I did endurance sport, right, in high school, but it did not prepare me for academy. You know what I mean? I did a little bit of weights in college, and that was more like social hour. But really, when it came down to it, when you do the job and you see those around you of varying fitness levels, those that have a good strength basis, those that have some decent musculature, they recover so much faster from the bumps and bruises, from the stepping off the curb and twisting their ankle. Their bodies are just durable. And I think that that's a theme or a key word that I want people to think about when they think about their own fitness for first responder work or just life, right? Like, you think about the aging population. I think, Chris kind of brought up the standard, quote unquote standard of, hey, you're laying on your back and you got to get up off the ground. Well, shoot, sadly, in gear, a lot of cops might not be able to do that, or not without a huge struggle. And that's not with someone like pushing them down or keeping on them, right? Like, that's a totally different thing. Just get back up. How many calories you're going to expend, and how are you going to hurt yourself trying to do that? But we know that's an issue with the aging population. So if we just think about what we're trying to build, I think that's just a great foundation. But yeah, Chris, I want to turn it over to you and see what jumped out at you in that last bit.
So the biggest thing that jumped out to me, and that's why I love chatting with Scott, is he talked about culture. And I feel like that is the best way to actually get agencies to start pushing this type of stuff to their either new officers or current regime, if you will. And we've had a lot of success with. That's why it jumped out at me. When we get a new batch of recruits, like, they have to work out every day with us. And we put them through the combatives program, where they have to do a 5-minute round robin of, they get a fresh instructor every minute, and sometimes they have to do striking, then they'll rotate to burpees, and then they're gonna do jiu-jitsu with one of our black belts. Then they got to fight over a gun in a mat room, and it's a 5-minute round robin, and it is very cardiovascularly and strength and all the power, all the above, because the last person they usually fight is me. So good luck trying to pull a gun away from me type
boss.
of thing. Exactly. So it's usually a very eye-opening experience, and we've had a bunch of success because we're very blessed that we have a handful of black belts at our agency in jiu-jitsu. So our command staff has allowed, I want to say it's 5 days a week. They have an hour during overlap in schedules. You're allowed to go do an hour of jiu-jitsu with these instructors. So that has changed the culture. That has opened people's eyes of, how hard is it to actually fight over like a gun or a weapon with somebody on the ground? Like, everyone thinks they're really in shape until it's like, oh shit, it's only been 60 seconds and I'm fucking gassed. Like, running a 5K and all that is great, and it has its value. I would say the endurance aspect has to be tailored to, how do I keep my heart rate at a reasonable pace, because the higher it goes, the less problem solving and thinking I'm able to do is usually how it goes, or it gets downgraded to a certain level. So whether it's I ran up 6 flights of stairs and now I have to start doing tactics and clearance and CQB, all right, how tired am I? Can my brain actually function under this level of stress? So I say the culture of the training as a whole has shown tons of success. If I would say add something else, the carrot is always better than the stick. So giving, hey, maybe if you pass this fitness standard, you get a free day off, versus, hey, we're going to hold this standard, and then you get suspended until you meet the fitness standard. I don't think that's ever going to be a thing in law enforcement. But again, every agency is different. So that's at least where we've had a bunch of success. Because I remember, and I've talked to a couple of recruits, like, hey, where's your motivation really lie? And it's like, oh, well, I actually walked in when the SWAT team was coming in, and I saw all the in shape dudes with their plate carriers on, and they looked all like badasses. Like, I saw that, and I wanted to be that. Like, people don't understand the psychological power of just having something to look forward to or look up to. Like even firefighters too. Like, I grew up with a house full of like big firefighters. All my uncles and cousins were firefighters, and my brother. So like, I wanted to grow up and be a big, strong badass one day. So the power of like having those role models or people to look up to, and the culture of the agency, like, are those the people who are good cops that have good reputations, that type of thing. Like, it all builds upon itself, and it's almost like a self-sustaining system. Once you get it to a certain point, it doesn't require any more work because you've kind of front-loaded everything, and you don't even realize that it kind of becomes this little ecosystem that takes care of itself, if you will. But it does take a long time to get there if you're starting from nothing. Trying to change a couple, like, dozen people's minds to start is the best way. But once you get, say, you create a bunch of disciples, if you will, that are going to go out and help and take the new cops. Like, hey, maybe it's just the FTOs. Hey, we're not taking lunch today. Eat in the car. We're going to go work out together, or we're going to go do jujitsu together. We're going to go do some extra training together. However you can like chip away at it is a fun problem to solve, but it's doable at every agency. It's just whether you get people to commit to the short term versus the long term.
Yeah, man, I love that. And you're speaking leadership, you're speaking culture. That's something I nerd out on a lot. And like, how do you get that to change? And a lot of times it is super gradual. A lot of times you got people that are following along with your guys' content or listening to this podcast that are of that vein. But guess what? Most of your organization might not be, right? So how do you get them to change over time? And maybe it takes a number of years, but I love how you laid that all out, because people need to remember that it starts with you. And then it starts with your like-minded people, right? You get enough people that are influential, and then, rewinding back a little bit to what you explained with the team, right? Like, there's this call-out culture of accountability, and we have to recognize that calling people out, or as prior guest Antonio Neves says, calling people up, is like of a place of care, right? I want what's best for you, man. You're on my team. I want you to be successful. I want us to be successful. I want us to be prepared. And so there are ways that you can have that be part of a healthy culture, even if it is ribbing. Oftentimes it's ribbing, right? But we all know when we have our friends or close partners, like, we can say some of the most heinous things. We know that there's the relationship, there's the care. It's not just like what you would say to a random person passing in the hallways, of course, right? So know your audience and how you want to navigate that. But you also talked a bit on incentives, and Scott talked about this too, right? Like, how do we incentivize this? And that could be through literal, like, hey, you get a day off. Hey, you get paid incentives. I love departments that have that pay incentive. But at the same time, we have to recognize accessibility. And you gave an example of that, Chris, where people can go roll on duty. It's very supported, right? Culturally, like, the brass want you to go in there, roll with our experts. Cool. Now you're all safer. You're getting out there more confidently. You're also functioning better. You're also de-escalating better. So you're avoiding force a lot of times because you have the wherewithal and the training and the mindset. But also, just to inject that in, I think that there's other things we can do to make that low-hanging accessible fruit, right? And so that is making sure that you have gyms in your department, you have people that can show equipment, right? Because if it is that bringing up culture, the last thing people want is a really intimidating culture where the most of the people are they're bros and they're athletes, but I'm over here, like, I can't do that. So it's intimidating. But I love what you said. A lot of examples of that. Scott, do you have anything off that before we go on to kind of what we would dream team build our fitness standards to look like?
No, on the culture piece, I always believe there's a little bit of the carrot and the stick, and that's a tough thing to manage. But I think, Chris said, like, you get a dozen guys, that turns into 2 dozen guys, that turns into 3 dozen. And I say guys, I mean cops in general. And for me, I hear a lot, I see a lot. Well, we're not supported through leadership here, and we don't have the resources. And I look, this is a thing that, I mean, these are legitimate things that do exist, but from a cultural perspective, you do not have to have a leader or whatever, somebody, at the brass level, to tell you that you need to be in better shape. You and that, and how important that is. That needs to be intrinsic at some level, and no, at a high level. I'm not going to even say at some level. You have to believe that this is important, and unfortunately, that so for Chris, like he was, that's how he was brought up. That's not how everybody is brought up, right? He knew it from the time he can remember. Like these are the influences in my life, and then when he got there, when he finally got into uniform and he saw the other guys, like those are the guys that I want to be a part of, because that's why I'm here, right? That is a tough thing to do. So, from a cultural perspective, it really needs to start at the beginning, and I think it's influenced not by brass. I think it's influenced by. I would start with middle management. It's those middle level people that have been doing the job, that have been walking the walk, talking the talk, that people see. People see this stuff. Like they get it, and they respond to it in many ways, but really one of two. If you want to break it down, it's either I want to be like that, or I'm intimidated by that, or I'm never going to be like that. That's where it has to stop, or where it starts. Like that has to change. Like again, the carrot of the stick is like, so I can either provide resources for you and motivation, and that may come from some ribbing or razzing or whatever, or it can come from, hey, this is the expectation. We get that you're not here now, but here's the resources and here's the things that we're providing for you, and here's whether it's the experts on the team or the people that do a really good job, are super passionate about this, that want to help you. Here's where you go to get that information. So you lead the horse to water, and you just, hopefully what you're doing is you're just making it feel really thirsty, like, and making it feel compelled to drink. Getting it to drink is the next step, but you have to get them to want to drink water, right? They have to feel thirsty enough, and that doesn't have to come from leadership. That should come from inside. And so I think what we need to be doing, when I say we, I just mean the collective we, and that includes civilians. They need to be propping up those cops that are good cops, that are taking care of their health and their wellness, and I mean that from an emotional and psychological sense down to their physical sense, because it all matters when you're out there on the street. What cop, and Chris said this to me, when I first met with him, and he put this in my head, is like, what cop do I want showing up when my mom calls 911, or when my daughter calls 911? I want the one that's been putting in the time. I want the one that's been doing the training, and I think that needs to be told to officers. What cop do you want? Would you want you showing up if your mom called because there was a home intruder in her house? Like, all the things that you need to be prepared to do when you go in there, and that could be anything from verbally de-escalating something, to being hands-on with somebody, to the worst case scenario, obviously having to use a tool, and escalate through that progression. So I guess my point here, without rambling, is this it shouldn't be dependent on leadership. As long as if we keep saying that, or if people keep saying that, we're always going to get what we got. Chris just said it. We're not going to fire cops for being out of shape. So that's just not going to happen.
Not these days.
No, it's just not going to happen. And we also we got to stop protecting their feelings. And that doesn't mean you have to shame them, but every time there needs to be a balance of dude, you're not good enough, and you should be able to tell somebody you're not good enough. But the problem comes back to the beginning of this conversation, like, well, how do we measure what good enough is? And if it's the Cooper standard, and you were good enough at one time, so just do that and you'll be good enough. If that's the culture, then this ends up going nowhere.
Yeah. You said a lot of things there, and I think there's a recognition that we start with ourselves, right? So ownership, and you take that and you build it out, right? So whatever position you have to recognize that you have a role to play in this more positive culture that is recognizing these needs, right? This fitness need. I'm an avid believer that all agencies should support people working out on duty, and give you the tools and resources. However, in prior discussions, like, ultimately, if they don't, it doesn't preclude you from having to do the work. It doesn't give you a pass because your brass didn't sign off on it, or you don't have a gym within your reporting district. No, dude, like, we had access to the gym, but at the same time, in the middle of the night, partly to stay awake, like, I would put my car in neutral at the city shops, and I'd push that thing and I'd pull that thing. and I would do pull-ups at the local playground. And yeah, there are some agencies that would cringe at that because of policy or whatever, like, but just find a way. Like, you can put a band. It doesn't have to be like a weight in your car, right? That there could be a safety component there if you roll your car and it's not, in the back secured. But put a band in your car. You can tie that thing to the push bars. You can get a lot of core work. You can get some explosive work. Like, the possibilities are essentially endless. So I just want to give a little plug to that. But yeah, I appreciate your insight there. Now, when we talk about the actual test and like what we're testing for, you guys have that extreme base of experience of like performance itself and building athletes. Now, I'll just share a little bit of a anecdote that when I tested for police and I tested for fire at the same time, I read the fire test and I tried to emulate it as best as I could at home. I never did like the prep courses or the training courses. I just went for it. Like, I threw two backpacks on with enough weight at 70 pounds or whatever, did the step mill. Well, I didn't have a step mill. I didn't want to take it to the gym, all these backpacks. So I just basically jogged stairs outside and jogged back down, which was way faster than what the pace was actually needed. Also, there were farmer's carries. You had to pick up a chainsaw. One hand, you had to walk it down to there. You had to drag a dummy. You had to do a ladder raise, which painting houses was super easy for me, but that required overhead press, right, of a moderate to lightweight, depending on how far you were. So all these very functional movements that fire's got it figured out, and it's not that complicated. You don't have to have the ladder. You don't have to have the chainsaw. You can have a weight. You could have this thing. You could have a rope. So I throw that all out just to explain, hey, if the other side of emergency response is doing it, logistically not that challenging. They've been doing it for a long time. What are some things that you guys would love to see? And maybe we've already spoken about some of them, but in your dream standards test, let's just start for like entry level so we don't make it too complicated with how to roll it out and all that.
If I jumped right in here, you just kind of explained something like the difference between the fire service and law enforcement. And I think in rolling this out, I think one of the things that you have to get people's heads firmly around is going to be the difference between training how to fight versus training for the fight. And when we look at that, what that means, are we creating scenario type training that somehow we've concocted this workout around what a scenario might look like? And so if I can do this really well, whether that's running around in your gas mask with your kit on and an ammo container and things, look, there's some practical, I think, value in doing some of that on occasion, but you're not going to get better at those basic foundations, the fundamental things that I spoke about before. Again, strength, speed, and power, capacity, that will impact that for that particular for that particular thing. But we got to look at what we've downloaded in order to be really good at those things. And again, that's going to be rooted in learning how to train versus training for something specifically. And so again, a little bit of that comes with the education, but you make a good point about like, well, firefighters have to do a lot of different things in terms of carrying equipment and going up and down and things like that. So it makes sense they would be carrying chainsaws and or saws and ladders and heavy equipment into a scene. So building a workout around that is actually, in my mind, a little bit more practical in some sense. But you still have to have these base foundations that you don't want to violate. You got to build strength, and that means progressive overload, right, over time. And then the question needs to be asked, like, well, how much strength do I need, right? How much strength? Like, does my 600-pound deadlift, is that really what value does that bring to the table, right? Well, there could be a lot of value to that table. However, if it impacts in a negative way and it creates like deficiencies in your speed and power and your capacity, going back to Chris's example of the 40-inch waist guy who's also a savage, and like how are we looking at these things? What are we testing? What are we actually trying to measure here in this workout that we're doing or this test that we're doing? So I think the question is okay, so how do we peel this back and start to layer things in that create the platform for somebody to be good at carrying the chainsaw, carrying the ladders, or getting over a 6-foot fence with kit on and a dog, and those kind of things. And it's not going out to the training grounds and running around in kit and throwing your dog over a fence. That's not where we should be spending our time. That can be done on occasion as a sort of an evaluation of like how does all the work that I've done outside of here, how am I expressing that when in these particular types of scenarios? So I think there's a lot of confusion around, again, training how to fight versus training for the fight. And I think that's kind of where it needs to start. And if you can get people's heads wrapped around that, and you ask them, well, what are the important things physically that you need to be able to do, that you need to have in order to be able to do that thing really well? And that's not a complicated thing to do. If you had 20 people in a room, 20 law enforcement officers in a room, and you asked them, I bet they'd hit the things. They would hit the things. They would, without having a deep level of physiology, exercise science, any of that stuff beyond, physiology of exercise, any of that under their belt, they could probably tell you. And if you can get them to do that, then that's the start, right? And then start to build things around that. I think that's where it needs to start. Like, let's just get some agreements on some things and a basic understanding, and then compare and contrast what you're doing versus what's actually important.
Chris, what does that look like to you?
I would definitely agree with everything you just said. It's when you actually say it like that, it sounds a lot more simple than it is, but we know there's a lot of ways it can get complicated. Because what are you trying to test? What are you trying to build? What is the ultimate goal? Are you taking age are you taking gender into effect? Like, is there a blanket test that just period pass or fail? There's so many different avenues that you can really go with it. And the best thing I would tell you, and we kind of touched on earlier, is educating your people and then getting some metrics to go by and then see if you can get people to improve. And that's the first place to start. And I love the way Scott just said it, like just doing, like, yeah, if we're training to throw a dog over a fence or do a carry in a gas mask, just doing that doesn't make me a better athlete. I love the people who are like, oh, I want to get better at running, so I'm just going to run more. Like, that's not how physiology works. Like, you have to, like, make your legs a little bit stronger, and then you build up to it, and then, hey, I can cover now distance with more strength, and then the science takes care of itself. So, and I know I've definitely talked to Scott about this before, like dudes who love to like kit up and plate carry a gas mask and nods and helmet and then do deadlifts. I'm like, there's a difference in like training for a task and like just showing off on the internet, and that drives me nuts when I see that.
Great for the gram.
Because a young 18 to 22-year-old cop sees that and thinks, oh, that's the recipe for success, when in reality he doesn't need to be doing anywhere near that shit. The more, I would, again, if it's an agency trying to instill a test or looking into testing, get some broad metrics in whatever way you can to see, one, where your buy-in is, where do you need to start, and okay, if you get some metrics, then you start like, okay, if the average officer out of a 200-person agency and the average push-up is like 12, all right, if I make the 20 as the minimum standard, I'm going to have a whole agency out of a job. So there unfortunately is a way that you have to kind of tailor to this. So that's where the combination of, all right, maybe front loading a bunch of knowledge, training, education, resources to the equation, then maybe get some metrics. Because not only do you have to play with, all right, do I need to create a pass or fail test, or do I need to just start working towards the culture and the resources and convince leadership, hey, maybe we don't need to buy the next version of this new body camera. What we have is fine. Let's put maybe $50,000 into a nutritionist or a strength coach or a physical therapist that can come teach us injury prevention. I come from a place of very spoiled leadership because my bosses are fantastic. We have an hour 3 times a week for on-duty workout. We have yoga classes. We have combatives classes. I'm currently working on the layout for our new headquarters gym. Like, we have all the resources you could pretty much want, except not having a home gym for the time being until probably hopefully next summer. I've traveled enough and talked to enough agencies. Luckily, with the privilege and the blessing of the position I'm in, I get to travel and talk to a lot of people. A lot of places have it a lot worse, so it's unfortunate. And another saying I like to say is, the greatest trick ever played on society is that all cops are like really badasses. And thank God for TV and media and all these cool TV shows that make us all look like badasses, because hopefully that image like makes a bad guy or a suspect think twice about fighting a cop. But that's not the case. I would say like 80 to 90% of these people, like, they don't care. Like, they may care a little bit, but not enough. And then there's this balance. And how do we get that 80 or 90% to change? And what's frustrating right now is, when I got hired, there were 600 people applying for 10 positions. Now there's like 10 people applying for 600 positions. And And it's frustrating because is the standard going to start becoming compromised because of vacancies that need to be filled? I know at
Yeah,
our
I mean,
academy, they lowered the wall. You have to jump over by, I think, 1.5 feet. It used to be like a 7 foot wall or 6 foot wall. Now it's basically, I could probably step over it because of my height. But what's the equation for that? Because I don't know one agency right now that is fully staffed. Everybody's got vacancies. Who's going to be the first one to start compromising their standards to get bodies on the road? It's
yeah,
a
they
it's a
already have.
weird
Yeah,
place to be in law enforcement right now.
yeah,
And that's a whole nother political driven probably conversation. But it's a very much a thing you have to be conscious of and very careful. And if you are trying to push for standards, how do you really go about in the safest, most productive way possible? Because it could basically grow into a monster that you didn't really expect.
I love what you just said there, and understanding what the metrics are, and that is really the hard place to start, right? Again, and that's why everybody reverts back to Cooper, because
Yeah.
that's the standard that exists. There was a lot of time, energy, and resource put into doing that research and doing those studies in order for those to even appear. So, like, again, coming from the fitness industry, owning a gym, we have, what we do is all personalized services. So you're working with a coach. If you come to our gym, you're working with a coach in some capacity. You're either in a personal training session or in a small group training session. Like, and those are different because the personal training session is built very specifically around the individual you're working with, based on needs, goals, past, present, future, health, medical histories, all those things. But if you jump into like a group setting where, we keep our groups fairly small so we can manage them, and we understand who our clients are. That's the luxury we have and why people come to us. But they're coming into those groups at any one of these levels in their future. Some people have been working out with us for 10 years, right? And some people it's day one. So how do you get somebody into the group so that they're working towards better fitness with also not being left behind, and also with a very general kind of idea of where they want to get to and where we want them to get to from all of these different I guess, like, domains of fitness. And so I say all that to say, when you're working in a department, you're trying to make change. That's usually that's usually one of the most difficult problems, is like, well, what should it be then? Where do we start with this? So that has to be established, and that's a tough thing to do. It's going to take some time, energy, and resources. So what are we comparing this against? Are we comparing this against our own officers? Is there somebody out there that's done some research and done some studies on this population and what it does? I can tell you that IEP has done that, but with a subset of the population. Again, working with the special operations type guys, to where we've developed at this point there's over 500 officers that have gone through this thing. So we have a pretty good understanding of the things that we're measuring and kind of what the averages are. And we don't rate it on pass or fail. It's more rated on, this is good, it's fair, or it's poor, right? And what are those things? Again, just going back to keeping it simple, you have to work on keeping it simple. Is it strength, speed and powers, or capacity? Where are your strengths and where are your deficiencies there? So giving people a pathway, if they're really good with the strength end of things, okay, so what do I do to maintain that strength and continue to maybe build a little bit, while also, maybe emphasizing the power and speed component or the capacity component of whatever it is they're doing, and how to fit it all in together. It's very tough. It's not easy. Again, going back to what Chris said, it's simple in concept, but it's tough to execute. And so that is a police culture thing. Like, people need to come together and figure out what acceptable or what good, fair, and poor actually is. But more importantly, like, what are the things that need to be good, fair, or poor, or we're evaluating as poor. And so those metrics are something that needs to be sort of decided. And with that, it doesn't need to be perfect. And I think working towards perfect with the expectation of having a very specific result is not a good place to come in with. I think you need to be more process driven and think about that, and get people's heads wrapped around the process, whether it's leadership all the way down to the participant that's doing it, about going through this process of getting better, learning, so that we can understand where the metrics should be as a whole, but also for those individuals to give them something to shoot for. Because if you bring the newbie in who's very uncomfortable, who's not fit, who hasn't been fit ever, and you're going like, I need you to look like and do what Chris can do. Like already, they've already going to be decided in your head. Like it's been a lifetime of Chris doing this. He's just never, he doesn't know any different, right? He's been doing this his whole life. You have to provide them pathways. So I think there are ways to develop like, hey, here's a fundamental type program for somebody that is kind of performing it. Again, I said poor, fair, or good. This is where you need to stay, and it's okay to be there right now, but this is the goal. We need to get you to fair, right? And then once we get you to fair, we want you to be good, and we want to instill that mindset in you that you want to be good, and here's why. And that's maybe where the carrot and the stick piece comes in. Again, you guys mentioned like maybe it's paid time off, maybe it's vacation, or maybe it's some type of acknowledgement or recognition or whatever, and base it on that, not on again, base some of the motivation on that, not on, like you're not good enough, but what happens if I'm not good enough? Nothing is what we're seeing. And as a result, you nailed it. I mean, let's be honest. I mean, I'll say it. The standards are moving backwards. You just mentioned the wall got lowered. Why? Because the walls they're still we still have building codes. Like the walls still have to be at certain heights, and that's what they're going to be faced with every day. So what are we really doing there to meet this number of, it's not 600 people, trying out for 10 positions. It's 10 people trying out for 600 positions. That already in and of itself is stinking thinking, and you're setting yourself up for failure. So going back to metrics, like what metrics are important for us in terms of the quality of the officers that we're trying to bring in, and the quality of the fitness that we're trying to help them achieve to be able to do the thing when the thing matters. It's that is not an easy question to answer, and we will certainly not solve for that on this call. I can tell you that. But there are people working on it, and those people need to get together with more of the other people that want solutions and want answers. And I think that's where it starts. And by virtue of this call, this podcast and what we're doing, this is what needs to happen. More of these conversations.
Yeah, and that's absolutely the point. I love how high level it went. I had a couple tangible things that I just wanted to nerd out with you guys about, right? But then it does go to all these bigger issues, not to say that they're insurmountable, but yeah, they're going to take a lot of time, and it's going to be people that have this expert level practiced experience and insight to be able to have these conversations, and then have the bosses listen to that, right? Like the boots on the ground need to be acknowledged, and that's like classic successful leadership is like you got to trust the people in the trenches that are reporting back this stuff, right? And every state has, administrators building these decisions, right? It's not just one person deciding what the fitness standard is or to get rid of it, but coming out of recruiting not so long ago, I was tracking and seeing all these states and these different cities that were lowering standards, removing standards. And I get in some regard, there is that economical decision, right? Where you have, the supply and demand's way out of whack, and you got to get people in seats. But at the same time, we have to recognize, and everyone that was part of those decisions had to recognize that there are consequences. There are these downstream effects that are, I mean, in an already very challenged arena that we're discussing for, over an hour now, right? That these are key things that we just can't let go of, right? I love the examples you gave as far as not just what are we evaluating, but how do we evaluate? And I think that's given the listeners a lot to think about, because even in an area like mine where it's pass and fail, well, maybe it shouldn't be, right? Maybe you should have these other contextual things. There should probably be a minimum, just like a written test. When you test to be a cop, any state, there's going to be a pass-fail. However, a lot of agencies still want to know what percentage you come in at, right? So the 90s come in better. And those that interview and they score their interviews, it's usually not pass-fail. You might get an 80, you might get a 90. And then that kind of plays into, I suppose, your hiring profile. Because if I have someone that ultimately, regardless of what the test is, and they score like an 80. However, in their interview, I learned that they do jujitsu, they do all this other stuff. Then I'm going to be like, okay, well, this is someone that can actually hold their own. And maybe they just didn't test well in this thing because they're a big dude that doesn't like to run a mile and a half. But at a sprint, deadly. Like,
Yeah.
I think that's really relevant for a hiring manager or hiring team or command staff to look at that. Just like if someone's background has this, this kind of red flag, but then they've done all this other stuff that fleshes out their whole experience. So I hadn't really considered in that way. I would be remiss if I didn't put you guys on the spot and ask you guys, what movement would you like to see, or what kind
Mhm.
of criteria would you like to see, even if there's one that pops out. Um, and it may or may not be the same answer when I want to ask, hey, what are first responders ignoring most commonly in your perspectives as far as like movement or strength deficiencies?
Uh,
My favorite movement is just a good old back squat.
mhm.
Under load, like whether it's weight on the belt or you can even do the belt squat, which I think
Yeah.
should be in every law enforcement gym in the country. Or you want to load your upper back with the bar. Being able to handle load, whether it's slow or fast, with power and strength, like in the deceleration process, like I remember, I think we were talking with Shelton Stevens at Jeff's conference. It's one
Mhm.
of their number one injuries is like for special operations guys is stepping off of a vehicle or off of an aircraft of some kind under load with 50, 60 pounds of shit on you,
Mm.
and they blow out ACLs and knees because of the deceleration process of just jumping with that kind of load. And that happens, I guarantee, just as much in law enforcement. We just don't have the metrics to measure because it's every agency for themselves. There's no governing body technically that compares and contrasts every single law enforcement agency in the country. The FBI and some federal agencies try to, but there's probably so much metric data that we could be taking advantage of that we'll probably never get because, again, everybody kind of fends for themselves unless somebody does their own independent study on a more of a micro scale, but you'll never get the macro results that you
Mhm.
want.
Mhm.
But even if it's like, can you back squat your body weight or 75% of your body weight? It doesn't have to be anything crazy, or it can be adjusted based on age.
Mhm.
Probably my favorite movement in the world is squats. And
Mm.
if there's some way to incorporate that, even if it's just now do air squats for 2 minutes or something. I would say that's probably, and pull-ups. I think squats and pull-ups will solve everybody's back pain, in my opinion, because every cop's like, oh, I can't do this because I got a bad back. Like, no, you probably have a bad back because you move like shit. I promise you, there's a way to fix your back. You just don't want to go through the really long, slow journey of unfucking that.
Hmm.
Where you haven't had a real strength coach like somebody like Scott who's like, hey, let's diagnose, why did your back fucking hurt? Have you had an MRI? What did your doctor tell you? Okay, your doctor said don't lift. Okay, why did he say that? Oh, I
Mhm.
don't know. And so dig a little deeper if those are the people you're dealing with, but that's a long answer to a short question. So
No, that's fantastic.
I'm going to come at this at a little bit at a similar but different angle, and I think like if we look at like how do you do it, there's so many things you could pick. But if I go back to like foundational movements, I mentioned them sort of at the beginning. Like every human should be able to squat, as he just said, like squat their own body weight to start, right? And then we can overload it from there. But when I look at them, I break them down, and it's really simple. You should be able to squat. You should be able to hinge. Most people would think of that as like a deadlift. You should be able to pull horizontally and vertically. So, like a seated row or a pull up. You should be able to push. So think of, the most common one would be like a bench press type of movement or pressing type of movement. You should be able to push overhead. And then there are some variations that come, with that. But then there's also things that need to be trained, like rotation. And those kind of fit into some of the other exercises we could do. And that's not something I would test. I wouldn't test somebody's rotation. And then, there's like a variation of the squat, which would be like some type of a lunge or a split squat or something like that. But if we had to break it down, like you need to be able to push, pull, press, and hinge. And so if I had to pick something, like Chris mentioned the back squat, because of the impacts it has on the body and what you're actually testing in terms of total body strength and the impacts it can have in terms of building total body strength, I love that exercise. The other one I like is a good old fashioned deadlift. Um, the deadlift for me, and a lot of people may disagree with me on this, but it's a self-limiting movement. We're overcoming inertia from the floor, so we're picking up this heavy object from the floor. Um, you pick it up off the floor, you put it back down. And so it's self-limiting. You can either do it or you can't, versus like if I'm underneath a bar, like I don't want to find out if I can't lift that weight, right?
Hmm.
Once I'm underneath the bar, so I don't crumple into an accordion kind of thing. But I like that movement for the same reasons I like the squat. It builds total body strength, the impacts it has on the central nervous system and the neuromuscular system, and what we can evaluate there in terms of really measuring strength based on this person's height, weight, age, gender, whatever. But I would also say this, like, does any of that really matter? Because like, certainly there may be I think you look at gender or sex as a thing here, because we know men are going to have a higher propensity to build that strength. But I've seen some really strong women out there that can do that are super badasses, that smoke dudes in their classes and in their fitness testing or whatever. I know several of them. I just spent the weekend with one here who like smoked half the dudes in her class, right? And she didn't need any accommodations made. My point of that is picking movements like that. So ones that I like that you could easily test, that are fairly self-limiting, and when we look at risk of injury, again, people might disagree with the deadlift. I think if the deadlift done properly or semi-properly, stop thinking about getting hurt. Just do the lift as well as you can. And again, being self-limiting, if it's too heavy for you, you're going to know really quick you're probably not going to be able to get it off the floor. Somebody might try to muscle the way through it, but I like that one. I like a basic bench press. I don't love that exercise for everything, but I think it's one people are semi-familiar with. It's easily tested, easily repeatable. It's a very valid test of upper body strength. It's semi-stable, and you're testing one thing, right? We know what you're testing here. And then the other thing I like is the pull-up, because everybody should be able to do a pull-up in my mind. There are ways to modify things so that you can get somebody that's not good at it to do it, but doing a pull-up, and then rather than how many can you do, maybe it's a percentage of your body weight, and being able to do that for X number of times. So you could do it loaded. Again, another very self-limiting movement that you either can or you can't. So based on the number that you get, that maybe dumps you into those categories, like, again, poor, fair, or good. But those types of movements, I think, are easily implemented, right? Any gym's going to have a barbell you could deadlift with. You're going to have a pull-up bar, and what gym doesn't have a bench press to do it in? So you don't even have to have a department gym. You could do that stuff, if you're training yourself as an officer or as an individual, you could do that at the gym or in your garage, or whatever. So those are good movements, I think, for just testing basic strength, right? Which gives you a really good foundation to kind of understand, again, the poor, fair, or good kind of category, and where you should be spending your time next. Because if you're crushing all those things, then let's move on to something else. Let's move on to the speed and power thing. Like, how do we test that? Because if you're really good with your strength, chances are you're going to be not terrible at some of the speed and power stuff, but you're going to find out some things. Where do you fall on that scale of fair, good, or fair, good? Sorry, poor, fair, or good. That's how my mind thinks about taking people through a process. And those are not hard exercises to put together. They're not hard to do. They're not hard to implement. If you have 50 people in a room and you were trying to do it all, you get 3 lines going. Obviously, you're giving them rest in between these things, but you have them do all these things, or start with the deadlift, then you go over, you do your pull-up, then you do your bench press, and boom, you're done. This is where you are right now. What do we do with that information?
Yeah, absolutely. I love how, you covered so many angles, and I love how, even though, we're talking about realistic carryovers and dummy drags and farmers carries, like, you guys both went to the basics, which is just another anecdote that whenever we're talking about a complicated thing, oftentimes it is like the low-hanging fruit, like back to basics, like just sound, functional movement. We're talking about squats, hinge, deadlift, press, right? Nothing crazy, pull-ups, right? Very accessible things. Just go to your local playground for those pull-ups. So really appreciate it, guys. Side note, it did say that maybe Chris's recording stopped, and I don't know how to toggle that, but there might be well, it says it's recording now. Just like this error message, I think, because you're getting a call.
And the phone probably just swiped up. I don't know if they reset something.
It might be fine, but in the off chance that didn't record or isn't recording now, and I'm going to edit this, but in any case, we'll still do. I'll have you guys kind of walk out anything you want to say and where people can find you, but just FYI. So we went and covered this, exhaustively, I want to say, in a good way, right? We're not just talking about fitness standards and tests and ways that people can improve, but I think regardless of whether the listeners were just intrigued by the title of like talking about standards and optimal performance, there is so much crossover, even if you're not the person that's going to be able to have a seat at the table to determine what your state standards are. The majority of us aren't. I certainly am not. But there are a lot of tangible themes and takeaways that hopefully you're applying to yourself, those you work around, maybe your specific team, if your team has a standard, as well as those, in my firm belief, a lot of people listening in on here are the leaders or future leaders, right? Maybe you're a sergeant, you're going to be a chief one day. Sorry about it. You're going to be a chief one day. Some of you out there, but you may have the impact and the actual influence to change some of these mechanisms. So all healthy food for thought. I really appreciate your guys' extensive experience and insight to these topics, not just strength and conditioning, not just first responder application of that, but to culture and leadership and these things that you guys are continually experiencing and putting out there. So really appreciate your time. If Scott, if you want to, please, anything you want to leave with the listeners on these topics, and then where folks can find you, and then we'll do the same for Chris.
I appreciate that. A couple things. First off, I'm a solution finder, and that's just kind of how I've been my entire life, and that's what I do in my professional career, is trying to find solutions for people's problems or the challenges that they're faced with. And so I recognize, like, there's a lot of information here to consume, and there's a lot of different angles you could go at it, and a lot of it is very conflicting at times if you're out there searching around on the interwebs with it. So I try. The teams I work with try really hard to kind of simplify it, but more specifically educate people on how to ask the right questions and where to go. So, I mean, the shameless plugs will come in this form. First off, we talk about this stuff ad nauseum on the podcast. We drop 3 episodes a week. On a Monday, you can hear my team at the gym talking about all things health, wellness, nutrition, fitness on a regular basis. We go deep dives on some topics. We do Q&As where we handle things in shorter segments, and we talk about all of this stuff. So just, it's free. Go out there, listen to it. Maybe you like it, maybe you don't. If you want to hear us talk about something or cover something, it's likely we've already covered it, and I might refer you to another one. Or if you want to hear us talk about something in more depth, you can always reach out to us. We love getting engagement from the audience on what they want to hear and what they want to learn about. On Wednesdays, I drop an episode with my team over at In Extremis Performance. It's very specific to law enforcement in terms of context. And there you'll hear us talk about things like we're talking about today and how they cross over to the other things that law enforcement officers have to deal with and are challenged by. And within that, just like with Red Dot, there are products and programs there that you can get into to help you in these areas that we're talking about. And I would start with, we have an assessment there. Again, it is more specific to the special operations community, but it does handle there's a physical assessment there where we go through some strength, speed, and power and capacity that you can do on your own. That's also free, so you can go there. I'll come back to that. And then on Friday, you can hear us talk to guys like Chris or guys like Eric about all kinds of different topics that may or may not interest you. The feedback that I get from the audience is the best way to explain it is they really like how we go in a lot of different angles. We're not just one thing all the time. Talked to a lot of interesting characters. Some of the stuff may feel or seem a little controversial, but we handle a lot of things. So go there. But Red Dot Fitness, if you go to rdftrainonline.com, you can find out everything we do there, product programs, get a free consultation, something like that. If you go to inextremisperformance.com, or that assessment would be iep-assessment.com. Again, you can go there and check out. Even if you don't want to do it, you can see what we're measuring or what we're testing, and maybe start to maybe look at how to throw that into your program. And then ironsightspodcast.com is where you can find all the information about all the podcasts we do and all the episodes. You'll find us find all those guys on Instagram and all those places on Instagram and on YouTube. So all we're trying to do is put out a ton of free content all the time, like you're doing, Eric, to just help people find direction and some resource to answer their questions. And it is a two-way conversation. You can always reach out to us.
Fantastic. Thank you, Scott. Chris?
Yeah, there's one thing I want to mention real quick is the first responder community there's 2 things that they all hate is change and the way things are. So you'll never make them completely happy, but like Scott just touched on, there's never been a time in our world that more information has been readily available. And I know every top is busy, but you can check your screen time. Y'all have 10 to 20 minutes to listen to a podcast, find a website or an Instagram page like Scott's or In Extremis or Jeff Nichols or Shelton Stevens, or find a subject matter expert to learn from. Like, you have the time. It's just you'd rather probably look at something stupid on Instagram than somebody who's sharing really valuable information that could better your life. So where do you want to apply your time is what I'm going to kind of finish on. So there's so many good people. If you don't know, please reach out to any of us. I'm sure we'd be happy to respond. I'm responding to random questions all the time. And if I don't have the answer, I'm glad to point somebody in the right direction. But if you need to get in touch with me, I'm at Tattoo Young Performance on Instagram. In January, I'm actually launching a new company, which I'll be chatting with Scott about real soon. Good Dude Concepts. We'll be coming out with products, and some of that's actually going to be workout related stuff, because my prototype right now, I've got some really cool gym equipment pieces that'll kind of be very, not sport specific, but fun to ways to mix it up at the gym. That'll just kind of challenge people in different ways, if you will. Not to pull the cat out of the bag just yet. So hopefully by January, everything will launch. But really appreciate you having me on. I love having conversations with good people, talking about stuff like this. Like, it's the only way to make communities and culture better. So I truly do appreciate the privilege of being on here and talking with you guys.
Thank you so much, and I'm excited to see what you have rolling out. I love looking at new gym equipment and testing things out as well. So that's super exciting, and I love what you said about just like that screen time thing, right? That accountability piece. We all do it, and we're all on social media. So for me, that whole becomes very apparent, right? Like you're on there posting, you're trying to do your content piece, and then you get sucked in. So everyone that uses it, you get sucked in. So just keep that piece, right? Remove the excuses for the podcast. I'm an avid listener as well, Iron Sight. So you all have to drive somewhere, and that's not a time to be on Instagram. So you may as well be, tuning your brain in and tuning that thing up. So no, thank you both so much for your wealth of experience and insight. We do need to have more conversations like this, and hopefully those that are geeking out during this whole conversation, they're carrying the torch for the industry and civilians, the community, as well as the people that maybe they lean in more on the the mental health pieces, but there's a lot of component there too, or the leadership pieces. Hey, there's a lot of tie in there too. Hopefully you heard all that and you're taking more, or hopefully we met you where you're at, and just bring that awareness. Like, get curious, tune into what Scott and his team are putting out, because there are so many topics that are extremely relevant, and then check out Chris's stuff too. So thank you guys again.
Oh, my pleasure. I appreciate being on. It's always an honor to sit with you guys. Always good time talking with Chris. I don't talk with him enough. I'll take full responsibility for that. I know everybody's busy, but look, Eric, I love what you're doing with the podcast in Blue Grit. We need more of this. If there's anything I can do to help or support you, and obviously you as well, Chris, don't ever hesitate to ask. I appreciate you guys.
Yeah, thank you. And last shout out to Chris, he's taken a break from his NVG training this whole time.
Right.
He's got an awesome backdrop that you all won't be able to see, but as far as doing tactical training today. So thanks, man.
My pleasure.
Thank you for tuning into another episode of Blue Grit Radio. As always, support this community by subscribing, giving us a 5-star review, and following, liking, and sharing posts on Blue Grit Wellness on Instagram. You can reach me there or email me at bluegritwellness@gmail.com. Be well and stay gritty.